Good day, citizens, and welcome to this week's edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast.
And indeed, this week, we're going back to sort of classical Jefferson conversation. And this week we talk about Jefferson and foreign policy.
It has some contemporary connections, but it's Jefferson's disappointment with the American people.
Well, it's a sad story for several reasons. One is that Jefferson is this kind of loving, idealist, small r Republican who wants to live in a kind of Virgilian, agrarian utopia.
And everything started out that way in term one.
But as soon as he becomes president, he has to face the Barbary pirates in North Africa, and then he has to face the Napoleonic Wars and provocations against American sailors and against American ships. And so by the time his second term ends in 1809, Madison tries to hang on with those principles, but Madison is drawn inevitably into the War of 1812, the Second War of our national independence. Jefferson staved it off, but it couldn't be prevented in the end, and it just broke Jefferson's heart to think that all we want, can't we all get along? All we want to do is live in a peaceful republic. Please just leave us alone. Please just leave us alone to thrive. And the world wouldn't do it.
I guess the contemporary connection is Jefferson went against his principles and messed with the livelihoods of many, particularly in the Northeast. And as the president said, I could have gone to war and I would have been very popular for doing so. He chose a higher path, and the price was paid by individuals financially. And I think there's a contemporary lesson in that. It may sound good, but when you start hitting pocketbooks of individuals...
Well, it turns out pocketbooks matter more than ideals, and Jefferson should have known that. But, most historians look upon the Embargo Acts and Jefferson's leadership during that period as one of the less admirable moments in Jefferson's life. I see it in the opposite way. I think a true leader is the one who looks at a situation carefully. Jefferson looked at everything carefully and says, well, you could do that and it would be popular, and you could do that and you could probably survive it politically. But what's the right thing to do? What's the most responsible thing to do for the United States and for the American people? And it may turn out that the most responsible thing to do is not the most popular. It may turn out, in fact, to be unpopular. And moral courage is being able to say, I'm going to do that. I'll probably pay a huge price for it, but I'm going to do it because of all the options that are in front of us. It's the least bad option, and we have to do the least bad thing, even if that's not the most popular thing that we can do. And he did it. And I think that deepens my respect for Jefferson. The easy thing to do would have been to say, well, once the Leopard attacked the Chesapeake, we are going to war with Britain, and I don't care how much it costs or how long it takes, but we are going to vindicate our national honor. We are going to war. And when Jefferson looked at that option, he thought, well, ruinously expensive, going to cost the lives of thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Americans, going to set back our economy. So if we're going to set back the economy, then the embargo is a better choice because it doesn't involve death. And so he believed that this is where one could maybe disagree with him. I don't, but he believed that it's too late in the world's history to solve our struggles through warfare. There has to be some non-bloody alternative to war. There's nothing inevitable about war, so there has to be some non-bloody alternative. And for him, that was economic war. We'll just wear them down because when they get tired of not having canvas and not having indigo and not having molasses and not having rum and not having wheat, they'll become nicer. Maybe that seems a little naive, but if you think about it, David, look, the people, I'm a North Dakotan, you're a North Dakotan. We don't go to war against the people of South Dakota. We sometimes disagree, but we don't go to war.
I want to alert our podcast listeners that this podcast introduction might go a little bit long, and because I want to answer some letters that we haven't gotten to. And one, this woman has received an inordinate amount of time in discussion on the Thomas Jefferson Hour, and she's going to get it again.
Who is this?
Allison Hagen.
Hello, Allison.
She was the one who got us to get Jefferson to admit that he hated dogs. Remember?
Oh, she's the dog lover.
Yeah.
Didn't hate dogs. He did not hate dogs.
She wrote a really nice letter about our conversation with Craig LaHoyer and Professor Harry Klee.
Loves dogs, loves tomatoes.
Yeah. And because of it, she has planted her first 3 baby tomato plants, including a Cherokee Purple. Good work.
That's great.
Good work. And
that's great.
On a non-vegetable note, I have a question for both of you, Clay and David. Well, this would have to go to you. They're headed to Europe this summer, including Paris, and you'd mentioned Jefferson's recommendations for travel abroad. I think she, maybe you want to just respond to her, but give her an idea of what would you go to see in Paris? Would you explore Jefferson's places in Paris? What would you suggest?
Well, you can. There are guidebooks to Jefferson's Paris, and I've been to them. They're interesting. If you have time, a canal trip is magnificent. Jefferson thought that his canal trip on the Canal de Midi between Marseille and Bordeaux was amongst the happiest periods of his entire life. Jefferson would want you to go to independent bookstores, go to the old Palais Royal, which is now kind of a public place. It's not quite the shopping mall and social center that it once was. You can't go wrong. I mean, go to the great parks of Paris. Franklin lived in Passy. John Adams lived in Auteuil. Those are part of the Bois de Boulogne, the great sort of central park of Paris. Go to those places and you can see things that date to the Maria Causeway relationship and to Jefferson's own love of walking wherever he happened to live. But, I think Jefferson would say, the earth belongs to the living. Whatever Allison and her family want to do, they will find it absolutely enchanting. And let me say to you, Allison, that Jefferson brought back shepherd dogs from Europe when he returned. He did in 1780. He brought back.
Maybe he didn't hate them.
He brought back a shepherd bitch, and she had puppies on the ship. And he brought back those dogs because he admired them. He wasn't an anti-dogite.
Okay. She closes by saying, my mother, myself, and all associated dogs are now members, 1776 Club.
Wait a minute. My mother and I and all what?
Associated dogs. We'll have to check on that.
Yeah.
Yes, it's about time. We are a good lesson learned to never give up on your wayward non-member listeners.
How nice.
We are happy to have finally done so, even if a little sheepish that it took. Sheepish.
Not sheepdog.
Sheepish that it took so long. And here's to more Jefferson and delving into the delicious complexity of our country's present history and the careful, respectful way.
Wait a minute. Say that last sentence
it.
Again. It's great.
And delving into the delicious complexity of our country's present history and the careful, respectful way you explore it.
It is deliciously complex. That's the theme of this week's program.
But this is like a perfect segue for me to say, if you'd like to support the
here
Thomas
comes the
Jefferson
voice.
Hour,
Yes, the voice.
We would appreciate it immensely. And Allison, thank you so much for joining the 1776 Club.
And happy tomatoes. I hope those tomatoes thrive in this world.
If you go to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate, and you'll find out just how to do that. And yes, they make me do this every week. And if I forget, I am admonished because we need your support to keep going. Thank you very much, those of you who have decided to support the show. And I think that's about enough.
I think so too. But I think this show is important. And I think it's not just important about where we are in the world.
Perspective.
It's important about Jefferson because it tells you who he was. The embargo tells you who he was almost more than any other moment of his life.
Thanks very much for listening.
Hey-ho, everyone.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me is President Thomas Jefferson. Good to see you, sir.
Good day to you, citizen.
I trust you're doing well, sir. I would guess you are enjoying Monticello and all the spring growth.
I love every season at Monticello. I can't imagine living anywhere else in the world. I wouldn't live in New England. I had to live in Philadelphia and New York for periods of time. And, of course, I spent 5 years in France. And while I was in France, I said every person's first country, of course, is his own, but every rational man's second country must be France. But I wouldn't even trade the best of my time in France for the glories, the simplicity, the family life, the gardens and the orchards and the fields of Monticello.
Well, sir, I think that makes you a lucky man.
Indeed it does, because I was fortunate. My father, Peter, was one of the first 3 or 4 residents in that part of the Piedmont of Virginia, and he in a tavern over a wager got some of the best land in what would become Albemarle County. And I, as the eldest son, had my choice of farms, and I chose what became Monticello, near my boyhood home at Shadwell. And although there were some difficulties there, we were living on a mountain. The water supply was not always adequate at the top of the mountain, and the fields were sometimes on a slant that made it difficult to avoid erosion. We were a comparatively long way from market. The best land in the state of Virginia was the tidewater land, which had been heavily filled with silt over millennia. But for all of that, I would never have considered changing my life at Monticello for anywhere else on earth.
I'd like to take you away from Monticello for this week's conversation, if I might, Mr. President, and talk about your policies with foreign nations. Would that be all right, sir?
Of course.
I would start with your first inaugural address, March 4th, 1801, where you said, "Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none." Now, I took that to mean that America should be a peaceful nation and trade with other nations, but we should not really try to develop allies. Am I getting that right?
Yes, I think that is correct. First of all, we're separated from Europe by a very large ocean, 3,000 miles. I consider that to be a moat that will secure us from the decadence and the wars and the religious superstition of Europe. We're fortunate to have distanced ourselves so greatly from the havoc of the old world. But I also feel that it's in our interest as a nation to be self-sufficient and to trade only for those things that we want, not things that we wind up needing, and that entangling alliances with other nations almost inevitably create chaos and compromise our national integrity.
This really goes back to President Washington, who called for us to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Am I right?
Yes, I think all of us felt that we should be a sort of self-sufficient fortress. We would trade with the rest of the world, of course. There would be cultural exchange. Some of our young people would go to universities in Edinburgh or Leiden or Paris or Oxford or Cambridge. That people from the old world would come here for diplomatic purposes and to study our flora and fauna and the magnificent outback of America, but that we would not allow ourselves to be drawn into the perennial feuds and wars and skirmishes and religious controversies that have bedeviled the history of the old world, that we would simply and cheerfully turn our back on all of that and be a mild-mannered nation in which everyone worships the God of his choice and where free speech is championed, and where we try to make sure that our focus remains on the pursuit of happiness and not the pursuit of power and glory and militarism and so on.
It sounds pretty good, Mr. President, but as a goal, but I look at what happened as you came into the presidency, and it didn't really work out that way, did it, sir?
Well, let me sort of back up and tell you what happened during my own lifetime, and I'm sure it didn't end with my death in 1826, but we create a revolution and we fight a long war of attrition until finally the British give up and go home. And then we signed the Treaty of Paris, which actually was exceedingly generous to us. It gave us everything up until the Mississippi River, so an immense territory. But almost immediately, the affairs of Europe began to harass the freedom and the happiness here in the United States. There was the French Revolution, and it bled over towards America and caused us a tremendous amount of political and social chaos. And then there was the World War between Napoleon and Britain, and we were nearly destroyed by that World War on a couple of occasions. There was the quasi-war in the Adams administration, a kind of undeclared naval war that we got ourselves into with France, partly, I think, because John Adams mishandled himself as the second president of the United States. But for whatever reason, we were engaged in this struggle. And then when I was president, the Napoleonic Wars heated up during my second term, and we were really in a very, very difficult position with respect to France and Britain. And I eventually chose a total economic embargo just to get us completely out of that difficult and bloody arena. And that embargo was highly unpopular here and cost me some of my own reputation as a peace-loving, mild-mannered president. And then if you think of the Tripolitan pirates, the North African Muslim pirates, that forced me to do what I never would have expected to do, which is to send a naval squadron and a group of Marines off to the Mediterranean to protect America's innocent shipping and our own interests in that sea. So, you just want to be left alone. You just want America to be left alone so that we can grow our own grapes and grow our own wheat and grow our own potatoes and manufacture our own clothing and manufacture our own furniture and look inside this tremendous continent of resources and live happier than any people who have ever existed in the world. And then from outside come these forces of piracy and greed and wrath and hatred, and they drew us in. No matter what we tried to do, they drew us in to struggles that we did not want to have.
So your dream was to have entanglements with
none.
It didn't really work out that way. There's a very respected historian by the name of Peter Onuf who writes, although Thomas Jefferson came to power determined to limit the reach of the federal government, foreign affairs dominated his presidency and pushed him towards federalist policies that greatly contrasted with his political philosophy. And you just mentioned piracy. By my reckoning, sir, that incident was the first real challenge in foreign affairs that you faced. Is that right?
It was the first crisis of my presidency. It was a contested election. Took 36 ballots in the House of Representatives before I was finally installed. I had almost no time to put together my official family, my cabinet, or even household staff at what you call the White House. And the first cabinet meeting I had was in May of 1801, and it was about new provocations by the Barbary pirates. They forced us to attend to them.
It is said that on May 15th, your entire cabinet voted unanimously to send 3 frigates and a schooner to the Mediterranean with orders to make a show of force, but try for peace.
For decades, we had been subjected to the piracy of the radical Islamists of the North African Muslim states, and we had paid bribes and paid tribute and paid ransom and leaned on Britain when we were still her colonies to try to protect us. And this had always rankled my spirit, and while I was the ambassador to France, I suggested to my friend John Adams, who was the ambassador to England, that enough was enough and that we needed to actually create some sort of a international naval squadron that could patrol those troubled waters and prevent this sort of piracy. And I felt that if you don't respond to one provocation, if you pay the ransom or pay the tribute, then more provocations are going to come. His view was, no, the United States doesn't have the money or the Navy to do that, and the world probably won't join us. So, and for the short term, said Adams, it's probably smarter just to pay the ransom. But I never liked that policy.
To give Mr. Adams his due, it was he who was fighting to build a Navy, and I believe you were opposed to it.
I'm not opposed to a Navy, but I want it to be purely defensive in character and inexpensive, if possible.
But this action with the Barbary pirates was certainly not, well, I suppose you could say it was defensive, but it was...
They declared war on us. I mean, they boarded our ships. They kidnapped and tortured innocent Americans. They put our men, our citizens, in filthy dungeons where they rotted, were ill-fed, lived with rats, sometimes were actively tortured. Then they demanded gigantic ransoms from us, and they literally declared war on us. It wasn't an act of war. They literally declared war on us. The Pasha of Tripoli actually went out with an axe and cut down the American flag, which there is a sign of intent for war. And so we had to react. And of course, I would have loved to just turn away. No part of me wanted to be drawn into this sort of thing. But when you're the President of the United States and another nation preys upon you and your innocent citizens, you wouldn't be able to hold your head up or responsibly serve as president if you didn't do what it took to protect the lives and the fortunes of bona fide American citizens. So we were drawn into something that I wanted no part of, frankly.
It must have been very difficult for you, Mr. Jefferson, to come into your presidency and so quickly have to turn to this kind of an action.
It is. It's like Satan coming into the Garden of Eden. Here we were, living in this magnificent new Edenic continent, and we just wanted to be left alone. Nothing could disappoint me more than having had to wage that war.
Mr. President, we need to take a short break from our conversation. When we come back, I'd like to talk about one of your other challenges, and that was the British Navy.
That's something I'm well prepared to talk about, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. This week, we're discussing foreign affairs, your foreign policy, and some of the challenges of your presidency, sir.
I became president in March of 1801, and most of my presidency was a time of peace and prosperity, and particularly the first term, because the Napoleonic Wars went into abeyance. There was a truce in 1802, and so my first term was really quite a quiet time for the United States, and we were so fortunate for that because we needed time to get used to our new constitutional system and to build the wherewithal of national prosperity and to gain confidence as a young upstart nation. But then in 1805, the peace broke down in Europe, and Napoleon and the British, Napoleon and all the nations that were leagued against him, went into a deeply serious world conflict, really a bloodbath. And we might have hoped to stay out of it, but there's no way that we could because we had merchant ships with molasses and naval stores and tobacco and wheat and indigo and rum and all the things that America can produce. These ships were all over the Atlantic world and in the Mediterranean. And what happened was that the British and the French were fighting essentially a war of national survival. Certainly that's how they saw it. And each one of them did things at sea to undercut the survival of their enemy or to maximize their own chances of survival. And the United States, without wanting to, got caught between these two vicious nations, and neither one of them treated us with respect. They treated us as if we were a non-entity, some kind of a pathetic little experimental nation that didn't have the wherewithal to assert its own interests in the world, and frankly, we didn't. And so we were put into an extremely difficult and vulnerable position, and I felt that the only answer at this point, since we didn't have a navy, we didn't have a budget surplus, we didn't have an army, really, I felt that the only responsible thing to do was simply turn inward and to close our ports and send nothing out and bring nothing in and just live off the enormous resources of our continental republic and wait until they fought it out. Somebody won, somebody lost, or they came to a truce, or at least wait until they agreed to treat us with respect.
But prior to the real troubles, Mr. President, there was great trade going on between Europe and the United States. It was a prosperous time, isn't that right?
Of course. A couple of things. We had resources that they wanted. Think of our naval stores, our trees, the tar, the hemp that we could produce, the canvas for sails. The United States is one of the great resource treasuries in the history of the world. We had things they wanted, our furs, our agricultural produce, not so many finishing goods. That more happened in Europe, but we had raw commodities, raw resources that the world wanted. And in addition to that, we had a highly ingenious and an acquisitive people. So we had merchants who wanted to fan out across the world and engage in trade. And I'm not really in favor of that. I prefer an agrarian economy, but I discovered that the genius of the American people is for trade. And whether I wanted them to be quiet subsistence family farmers or not, their decision was that they wanted to be out into that economic arena in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic and in the Caribbean, and there's not a thing that a president could do to stop it, and nor should he if that's the decided preference of the American people. So once you send out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of boats, of ships across the Atlantic and into the Mediterranean and Caribbean, there are going to be international incidents, even in times of peace.
But there was a neutrality agreement early in your presidency that you were able to maintain good relations with both the French and the British, so it was a boon time for American merchants.
But then when the Peace of Amiens broke down in 1805 and the true war for national survival began between revolutionary Napoleonic France on the one hand and monarchical aristocratic England and her allies on the other, then our innocent little trading ships, essentially the size of yachts, were ground up between these two ferocious combatants. And all we could do, since we didn't have a navy, is to try to withdraw from that troubled arena.
But something happened that really turned public opinion away from this peaceful trading alliance. The impressment of sailors. The British, it said, impressed 6,000 sailors from American ships, and it really angered the American public. Am I correct in that?
Well, of course, because imagine this, that we send out our ships, and they're filled with American sailors, born in Nantucket, born in Boston, born in Pittsburgh, born in Charleston, born in Charlottesville, for that matter. And these Americans go out across the world. The British Navy, which is notoriously violent towards its workers, towards its sailors, and they're radically underpaid, and they're constantly short of personnel, especially at a time of international crisis. So the British began boarding our ships and kidnapping American citizens to serve in their Navy. And our citizen could say, wait a minute, I was born in New York. I've lived there all of my life. You can't kidnap me to serve in the British Navy. And the British would say, well, how do we know you're an American? You speak the English language. You have no papers. There's no birth certificate. This was way before such public records existed. We think you have escaped from a British merchant ship, or you're AWOL from the British Navy. So we choose to arrest you, and we're putting you on such and such a ship, and if you don't like it, well, you can try to file some sort of a legal action in international courts, but good luck with that. And so They were taking advantage of the fact that we spoke English and they spoke English, that we were so recently derived from Great Britain that it was often hard to tell regional accents or to prove that somebody was an American who happened to speak the English language. And they were taking advantage of this, you might call it loophole or this ambiguity. There was nothing we could do about it. We didn't yet have a large enough government to issue the right kind of paperwork and passports to every one of our citizens who were working on these ships, and the British probably would not have honored those passports had they existed.
And then in 1807, there was an occurrence between the British warship Leopard and the American naval frigate Chesapeake, which led to cries for war.
Oh, they fired upon us in American waters. There was no reason for the British to fire on the Chesapeake. This was a naked act of imperial aggression. Of course, we were appalled. There were deaths of innocent Americans. Then they went further and impressed some of the sailors from the Chesapeake. When this became a public knowledge in the United States, as you can well imagine, there was universal outrage. I mean, the American people were not just appalled, they were so deeply offended by this, an act of naked aggression against the sovereignty of the United States on our side of the Atlantic, not in the Azores or some other place, but right off our coast, that the American people would immediately have gone to war against Great Britain without calculating the likelihood of success or the cost or anything else. The American people were so stirred up and angry, and I believe they were right, that they were prepared to go to war instantaneously against Britain. I did not want to do that.
This must have been very difficult for you, Mr. Jefferson, starting in your first term with this, our happy republic, and then looking at potential war with another great nation.
Not just a great nation, but the most powerful navy in the world, and a nation that was much more comfortable in war than the United States has ever been or ever should be.
My understanding is that you banned all British ships from U.S. ports, and you ordered state governors to call up 100,000 militiamen. And if you can help me, Mr. President, what were you thinking? I mean, you had to change your policies so much.
I wasn't going to go to war against Britain unless it was absolutely necessary. My view is that we were too fragile, too new, too young, too inexperienced to fight wars of this sort. I'm essentially a pacifist anyway. I believe that most wars are unnecessary and are fought for the wrong reasons, and that most wars end with the restoration of the conditions before the war. That's called status quo ante bellum, that most wars wind up rewriting the same boundaries and affecting the same trade relationships. And so I am a principled opponent to warfare. It's enormously costly. It kills young men's lives for no good reason. There's often what you call collateral damage. There certainly is a prostration of the economic life of the countries, and every dollar that you spend on these ships and these soldiers and cannon and gunpowder is a dollar that you can't spend on public education or on internal improvements. And so I don't like the idea of war. And I also knew that whatever my own personal philosophy of war and peace might be, it would be ruinous for the United States to fight a war against Great Britain at that time in 1807 or 1808, because they were infinitely more powerful and wealthy than we were, and they had an alacrity towards war that is not part of the American spirit. And so the question was, then what? If you're not going to fight a war with them, then what? And so all you can do is withdraw from the world's troubled waters. And so I thought a total economic embargo, nothing in, nothing out, period, was really the only responsible choice at this point. We could have rushed into war. I would have been a very, very, very popular president had I done so. But I knew that would not be good leadership, that you should not succumb to the volatility of the people when they're suddenly swept up with national pride in that way. You need breathing space. You need to step back and think it through, think strategically, think for the long term, and ask yourself not what is the righteous thing to do, but ask yourself what is the reasonable and responsible thing to do.
So your reasoning was that Europe would be so dependent upon our raw materials, as you talked about earlier, that by doing an embargo, you would get them to respect our neutrality?
Yes, and just look at it this way. If we had built a 5-mile wall on the eastern seaboard, 5 miles off the coast, and so we would never, under any circumstances, have any further intercourse with Europe, we would be in two separate worlds, as if we were Mars and Jupiter, we'd be just fine because we have the Mississippi Valley, we have the Ohio, we have forests unprecedented in the history of the world, we have lead mines, we have gold, we have fertile valleys in which we can produce wheat and oats and potatoes and barley and alfalfa. The United States does not need anything from Europe. There may be things that we want, but there's nothing that we have that we need from anybody else. And so we are unique. Britain can't do this. They're a tiny island. They need things from all over just to survive, just to feed their people. But we have this unique capacity because of the size and the fertility of America. We have the opportunity, if necessary, to close that door, to erect a sort of metaphoric wall between us and Europe, and then to live within our own continental resource base. And my view is, in the long run, they need us way more than we could ever need them, and they will come to their senses.
You called this the Embargo of 1807. In my time, Mr. President, we loosely call these sort of things trade wars. You must have known when you signed this into law that it was a gamble, sir.
Well, first of all, I don't agree with your term trade war. An embargo is not about tariffs. It's not about profits. It's about national sovereignty. But I'll take your point. So it did come to war. It's a form of economic warfare. Let's call it that. My hope was that we could outlast Europe, that in the long run they would realize we need the resources of North America much more than they need our scarves and wines and furniture. And therefore, I thought that Britain and France would come to their senses and say, whatever else is true, we gain more than we lose from American trade, and therefore we will behave with more respect. They didn't, but here's the part that I did not know, sir. Here's the part that I suppose you could say broke my heart. I thought the American people would understand the purpose of the embargo and therefore agree to it, including some of the sacrifices that they would need to make. Because think of the merchants who would no longer be able to send their ships into the Mediterranean or the Caribbean.
It said, Mr. President, that the exports plummeted from 108 million to 22 million within the space of a year.
Yes, and I thought that the American people would understand that this was a sacrifice, of course.
Did you ever address the American people and explain to them the dangers of this policy?
No, sir, I never addressed the American people at all. I mean, period. In the whole course of my life, I gave an annual message to Congress. I didn't carry it personally up to Congress. I sent it by courier, and I gave a few newspaper interviews of a very informal sort during the course of my 2 terms as president, but there was no what you would call media infrastructure for me to address the American people. I never would have even conceived of such a thing. It was a physical impossibility, but it also was not in keeping with my own idea of how a republic works. I don't think the president should ever become that significant and that powerful an individual. But at any rate, I made no attempt to explain this to the American people, but friends of mine did. Friends in the newspaper business and political friends wrote what you would call guest editorials or newspaper columns to make the case for the embargo. But it turns out this is the sad truth of this, that the American people, not all of them, but a very substantial minority, preferred profit to national sovereignty, and they smuggled, and they bribed, and they worked around these embargo regulations, and they were very unhappy with me. They burned me in effigy in some places. I was cursed. I received most of the hate mail of my entire life during this period, and I was so saddened to think that that they weren't seeing this clearly, because the alternative was one of two things. If we didn't do an embargo, the alternative was war against Britain and maybe also against France, or a kind of national surrender to the sort of bullying, the impressment, the boarding of our ships, the confiscation of free goods in free ships, the intimidations, and the unfair trade tariffing policies that these nations were exacting against us. And in that choice between surrender or war, I'm going to choose a third middle ground if I can.
Still, Mr. President, it must have been devastating to you to understand that the nation lacked the Republican virtue to follow through with this, and that it did end the way it did.
You said that perfectly, sir. It disappointed me that in one of the tests of what a republic can be, the people of the United States, or at least a loud minority, chose to behave like just another self-interested nation seeking profits and glory and not willing to do the hard thing that comes from time to time. The world is sometimes a very dangerous place, but if you are the one nation that represents human ideals, you may at times need to suffer for those ideals. And the suffering that I'm talking about, not being able to send a ship of molasses to Portugal, is infinitely better than telling your sons and grandsons that they must go to war against France or Britain or both, because not all of those sons are coming back.
For what it's worth, Mr. President, I do appreciate your position, and thank you for avoiding war. I think it took a lot of character and courage on your part, but sadly, sir, we've come to the end of this part of our conversation. We do need to take a break. I thank you, Mr. President. You're listening to The Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson, and it was a very enlightening conversation with Mr. Jefferson this week. I am now joined by the gentleman who portrays President Jefferson, the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, my very dear friend, the semi-permanent guest host.
I'm proud to be.
Of the Thomas. Today's program moved in some directions that I was not expecting. Perhaps you were. And this conversation about the embargo is, I think, the best conversation we've ever had about that subject. But I think of this, that Jefferson was an idealist and maybe a utopian. We get that. But he was also a realist. And he realized that we didn't really have a good option.
Yeah, in prepping for this program, I came to the exact same conclusion. What I thought was so significant was, he came in with this massive amount of public support and his dream of citizens and the Republican virtue. And by the end of his second term, he had changed dramatically to the point of even embracing some Federalist policies. Am I off base?
Well, I disagree a little bit with Peter Onuf's view that he was sort of moving towards federalism. I take his point, but Jefferson had to enforce the embargo, and so enforcing the embargo turned out to require a lot of executive power, and indeed executive power that Jefferson was uncomfortable with and would have condemned in anybody else. And so that's the curse. If you want to be an idealist, never hold power, because you get faced with these situations where There is no good answer. There's no smart way to get through this without goring oxes in every direction and compromising your own sacred principles, which happened to poor Mr. Jefferson here.
I'm thinking even in more down-to-earth terms than power and war. He did what he never wanted government to do, and that was he intruded on the private lives of citizens. And I'm thinking specifically of the Embargo Act and all those Northeast merchants and that were affected by government policy, and it affected them in the worst way, and that's how they made a living. And
there's a book about this by Leonard Levy. It's called Jefferson and Civil Liberties, The Darker Side. It's a great book. It's been around for a long time. It was one of the first really critical books about Jefferson. I think it was written in the 1970s. Leonard Levy was at the Claremont Graduate School, and I knew somebody who had studied with him when I was out there teaching briefly at Pomona College. But Leonard Levy wrote this book, and when you read it, the embargo, Jefferson's view of the First Amendment in certain situations, Jefferson and a bill of attainder that he wrote when he was governor of Virginia, which is basically a way of legislating a person to death. If you add up all the things that Jefferson did in the course of his lifetime that don't really square with our idea of Jefferson the civil libertarian, it's a pretty strong indictment, and you wind up kind of being disillusioned a little with Jefferson.
But you take my point. I mean, if Jefferson had been given this proposal and he was not in charge or president, he would have said, absolutely not. We're not going to, mess with the lives of individual citizens.
Of course, but then he got power and he had to do it.
Yeah, and I guess that's the point.
It crushed him twice. It crushed him in a way that he never talked about, which was that he had to violate his own sacred principles. But it crushed him even more that the American people just didn't get it. And really, David, I just want to talk about this for a minute. So you take Iran, take North Korea, take Syria. These are extremely complex situations. Just take North Korea, for example. No rational person can look at this without feeling disgusted that South Korea is a vibrant, economically prosperous place where the quality of living is amongst the highest in the world. It's not a perfect society, but it works. And there is a very substantial due process and tradition of civil liberties in South Korea. North Korea is one of the most despotic tyrannies that you could possibly imagine. It's not just contrast. It's night squared versus day squared. And the world stands by and watches this, watches millions of North Koreans being treated as badly as human beings can be treated on Earth and does nothing about it. Then the temptation is, well, what would it be? And when you get something like what's going on now, where there's a kind of an arms race and a rhetoric exchange between their leader and our leader, you think, well, what's the right thing to do? It turns out there's no right thing to do. The same is true of Iran. The nuclear deal that we established with Iran is not ideal, but what's the alternative? And so you get to these situations and you realize this. First of all, there's no easy answer to any of these questions. That's first. Secondly, whatever answer you take is going to have consequences and unintended consequences and ripple effects that it's important to try to see before you act. And third, even if you had unlimited power and no opposition in the world, it's not clear what the right answer to some of these questions is. You want experts who have spent their lives studying Persian, Farsi, Sunni versus Shia, the history of Iran, the history of that part of the world, the history of nuclear weaponry, the history of government rhetoric in their country and in ours. You want experts who have spent their whole lives doing this to weigh in on this, and then you don't know what to do. And so to think that we now have leadership that just says, oh, we'll do that, we'll bomb this, we'll withdraw this, we'll go back, we'll renegotiate this. Oh, yeah, well, I know what to do. The world is almost infinitely complicated. The world is almost infinitely complex, and the only hope we have is to avoid what struggles we can to live with things that we find largely unpalatable if we can live with them. And when we act, to act on the basis of a very, very deep understanding of what's at stake. And not to beat up on the current president, when we invaded Iraq after 9/11, we went into a situation that turned out to be profoundly more complex than we could ever have known. That should be a lesson to us that most Americans, including most members of the Senate, could not have told you in the year 2003 the difference between Shia and Sunni. They could not have told you that fundamental difference, and yet we waded into that struggle.
As you just said, it should be a lesson to us. And then I go back to our man Jefferson in this week's discussion. And I just, I'll say this once more. I just think it's really fascinating to look at Jefferson, who came in with these high, dreamy principles of what he envisioned America to be. And by the end of his presidency, the reality of the office and the weight of the office made him realize that he had to bend a bit.
Jefferson was disappointed in the American people twice. The first time was during the embargo, when he realized, they're pretty much what John Adams said. They're in it for themselves. They're not gonna do this in the name of national experimental sacrifice. And the second time was during the Missouri Compromise of 1819 and 20, when he realized, we're moving towards a sectionalist system in which there will be free states and slave states, and it's going to bake in, is the term we use now. It's going to harden, and this is going to create permanent sectional differences that are going to pull this country apart. Those were the two times in his life, a life of 83 years, that America's greatest optimist was disillusioned with the behavior of his fellow citizens. And, when I think about the embargo, it just about breaks my heart to think of poor Jefferson realizing, to enforce this thing, I've got to behave like Hamilton, or maybe worse. To enforce this thing, I have to sacrifice some of my deepest held principles of the Bill of Rights and due process. And it must have just been so terribly disillusioning for Jefferson. And let me just give you one quick more example, David. When Woodrow Wilson was president, he came after Taft. He expected his 4 or 8 years to be about domestic policy. And then, whammo, World War I, he was not prepared to be a war president. He did not wish to be a war president. He actually exclaimed, I wanted to be a peace president. I wanted to do things to make the United States a more fair and progressive nation, and now I'm being sucked into this other thing. It killed him. I mean, it literally killed him. He had his stroke. For the last years that he was in the White House, he was an invalid. His wife had to essentially run the country as the proxy president of the United States. World War II essentially killed FDR. Jefferson is lucky. He got through that terrible metaphysical crisis, the crisis of democratic faith, in 1808 and 1809, and retired to Monticello. And then he had 17 good years there where he was able to write lyrical letters and to grow his petunias and to rebuild the strength of the soil at Monticello, and design and finish Poplar Forest, and design and complete the University of Virginia, and reconcile with John Adams, and give his grandchildren their first Shakespeare, their first guitar, their first prom dress. Jefferson somehow survived that ordeal. It could have killed him. He might have had a stroke. He might have become embittered, but he wasn't. He was so Jefferson that once he got out from under it and went back to Monticello in the spring of 1809, he recovered and had a really extraordinary retirement life that, although beset by economic problems, but a retirement that brought a kind of deeper serenity to his life experience, and that is not necessarily predictable.
You talk about Jefferson and his enjoyment of retirement. It makes me think about, the Jefferson Book Club. We're going to be discussing Founding Family by Joseph Ellis.
That great book. I just finished it.
Right. We're starting to get some questions.
So send in your questions to us.
Go to the Jefferson Hour Facebook page or jeffersonhour.com to submit questions. If we look at those two men,
which two?
Adams and Jefferson. I'm just reading about, in that book, I remember reading about Adams wanting to get out of Washington and get home, and it looked like Abigail had recovered, and he was just excited to get home. And here's Jefferson trying to do the same thing. You said there were two things that you looked at that disappointed Jefferson. I'm going to suggest a possible third, and it was something that I wanted to talk to Mr. Jefferson about but didn't get to, and that's the slave trade. I think he was really disappointed in the younger generation that they didn't follow through. There was no move made to abolish slavery. He did convince Congress to block the foreign importation of slaves.
In 1808, that was the 20th anniversary when it first became constitutionally possible.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask President Jefferson his thinking behind that as
you say that there's
policy.
kind of a third disappointment was that the younger generation didn't solve the problem of slavery. Certainly that's true, but that's tied up with this Missouri Compromise. What he discovered in the Missouri Compromise was that the next generation and the one after that, so far from getting better on the question of slavery, had actually hardened, that slavery was deepening in American social life in the South. And that really upset him. His sort of Pollyanna view of things, David, was always that the future will always be more just and more honorable than the past. And so our children will be better citizens of a republic than we have been, and their children will be better than they have been, and slavery will therefore disappear because we all know that slavery must go, but it's just a question of finding the right mechanism and having enough critical mass in our culture to do it. And then when he discovered in 1817, 1818, 1819, 1820 that so far from getting better, the country was hardening and slavery was going to become a deeper, more intractable problem for the United States than he could ever have conceived. That was another of those heartbreaking moments. So you're right that the question of the young generation and slavery was deeply unsettling to Jefferson.
Well, once again, I've done a poor job as the
permanent guest host.
I've cut our time a wee bit short. We still have a few minutes left, but can we save your essay for next week?
I think the public will wait. When you told me a few months ago that if you add them all up, it comes to like 40 hours, I just blushed.
Well, that was a whole year.
But still, but I'll save it. But
I've got a good replacement here, and that is I have a number of questions. First off, I have to thank President Jefferson and you for a really interesting conversation. I think some contemporary connections, too.
Oh, my. Just what's going on in the world with respect to Syria, Iran, and North Korea alone requires us to think historically, I think.
So let's answer some listener questions. One from Brad Turner. Good day, citizens. First off, let me say that I love the pod. Oh, thanks so much. But we don't need to read all that. My wife and I are planning our first trip to Monticello in May. What recommendations do you guys have for our visit? We'll be touring the gardens and hope to run into Pat Brodowski. Well, you could start right there.
So Pat is now like this rock star. So Pat, are you listening? All of our Jefferson Hour listeners come there. And they do the tour, and they buy their gifts, and then they go to the garden, and they say, is Pat here? And then Pat treats them like royalty.
Well, if they tell them they're...
Yeah, but when you and I
Jefferson
go
Hour.
there, she's like, here's a ham sandwich, sit in the corner. I mean,
you poor thing.
She gives
That's not exactly true.
It is true that she gives this royal treatment to mere strangers who say that they're Jefferson Hour listeners. And when I go, she's like, oh, yeah, buddy, there's the line.
I have before me a letter, and she took my advice and sent it to me so that it wouldn't get lost.
Yeah, because I'm a little bitter, Pat.
I'm telling you, I'm going to publish some pictures of your library.
Yeah.
But she sent us some seeds, and we have shared them, and some wheat seeds that you were real anxious to get. I don't have the room for wheat
kernels that date back to Jefferson himself, apparently. And
also some peas, the Tom Thumb pea, just a handful of seeds.
His favorite vegetable was the pea.
A cluster pea, the cutest short bushy plant. I will be trying those in my garden. And we have some more gardening letters in response to our tomato show we'll have to get to.
To our friends who've just written asking for advice about Monticello, number one, of course, Pat. She's as gracious a person as you will ever meet. Number two, you don't know how often you'll get there. Spend the money for the VIP tour.
It says options for a house tour, standard day pass, behind-the-scenes day pass.
You want to do the most expensive ticket possible because you get – this is This didn't used to be the case, David.
Yeah.
You
Don't
couldn't
worry
see
about the
these
money,
rooms.
just like Jefferson, right? Yeah.
Don't worry about them. No, really, it's worth a trip across the Atlantic, as Jefferson would say, to see Monticello, and you may as well pay the price. And Pat will be grateful to you, of course.
So with that, sir, we're just about out of time for this week. I do want to thank everybody who's been writing us. We're going to try to get a few more answers to email in next week.
But people need to remember that there is this book club, and we're going to be doing about a book a month in the book club.
Go to jeffersonhour.com and you can find out more and submit questions.
First book is First Family by Joseph Ellis is the first book, and we want everyone to send in their thoughts and questions and to read this extraordinary account by my favorite American historian. We'll see you all next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.